All right, guys, we are in Chapter 6 of American Government, American Civics. Again, I'm going to assume that you don't have your textbooks and you don't need your textbooks. If you've got them, great. That'll help you answer the questions for the quiz. Again, the purpose of these videos is not to give you every single detail of these chapters. The purpose of these videos is to give you an overview and to help you with the quizzes that I emailed to you. Again, those quizzes are, there's two things you're going to have to do with these videos. First of all, you're going to watch the video, and as soon as you complete that, you'll email me saying, okay, I've watched the Chapter 6 video, or if you've watched all three, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, and Chapter 7, first go take a big nap, because that's a lot of watching me, and who wants to do that? But when you're done with that nap, email me to tell me that you have completed. Like I said, you can tell me that you've completed one of those, or that you said, hey, I've watched all three of those videos. And use the information that's given, because again, I'm just going to go over basically what you would need to know for the final at the end of the year, assuming we have a final, and of course for these quizzes that I emailed you. Now, for right now, the plan is just to have these three emails, or I'm sorry, these three chapter overviews. But obviously, if we extend out the shutdown, then we will discuss the other chapters. We might even have to go through the rest of this book. Hopefully we don't have to, it doesn't come to that, but it is a possibility. All right, so Chapter 6. Chapter 6 deals with the executive branch, which I know we've talked about extensively in class, which of course is the United States presidency. Now, I should point out, when our forefathers got together in 1787 to deal with, okay, well, how is the American government going to work? How is it going to function? They had no idea in creating a presidency that they were going to create basically an institution that was going to be so powerful, so influential. Remember, these are American citizens that resisted a British monarchy, a British ruler, British king. They had no desire to create a king and a one single person with this much power. So they did not set out to create that position of authority. It has changed and morphed as years have gone on. And you guys are going to talk. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. But I encourage you all to read that on your own. Also, I would love to spend some individual time talking about the American presidents, because it's one of my all-time favorite subjects in history, is the study of our presidents. But we do not have a lot of time for that today. So I will give you a few little bitty pieces of notes that I find interesting, but overall we are not going to cover every single detail of this. All right, so even that title, president, that was an attempt for them to kind of avoid, our forefathers to avoid creating the same mistakes that had happened before. Again, they did not want a king. And again, of course, the term president doesn't sound real threatening. After all, a president is just someone who presides over, who oversees. So you think about, for instance, that meeting, when they met together in Philadelphia to form our Constitution. At that time, they all knew pretty much that George Washington, who presided over that meeting, he would probably sit in a similar position presiding over the country. And so that's where they came up with the term president. And of course, George Washington would go on to become our first president. And of course, he became so without any type of challenge or true debate. There's a lot of questions that are usually asked by my students about the Electoral College. And we're going to cover that a little bit, because it's actually a really important topic. And I truly believe if you study it, it's a core principle in what sets us apart as a country. You don't have individual states or larger cities, larger populated cities or states that control the outcome of the election. And you're going to see how that's changed and morphed as time has gone on. So let me kind of just go over this a little bit with you. So one of the most important debates of the Constitutional Congress centered on this idea about, okay, how do they select a president or a chief executive? And some of the delegates thought that Congress should elect the executive. So there was actually some who debated that, hey, maybe Congress should make this decision for us. Maybe they were the ones who would be the most qualified. Others said that the people themselves should elect the executive, but there was fear in that. A lot of, some of this is justified, some of this is not. A lot of the fear was, okay, well, that the ordinary citizen would not be educated or intelligent enough or connected enough to truly make the best decision about who would be the elected president. And that does kind of make sense if you think about it. These are men who were well-rounded, well-educated. They were really concerned about giving the power and authority to just anyone to select such a powerful person. So the Founding Fathers basically came up with an idea. The delegates devised a plan. Each elector would be able to cast 2 votes for the president. The candidate with the most votes would be president. The candidate with the second greatest number of votes would become vice president. So that's why you've got situations where you would have, trying to think of an example, John Adams in 1796 became president. He received the majority of the vote. The guy who actually was his opponent, who was a Republican, John Adams, of course, was a Federalist, that was Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson actually served as John Adams' vice president, even though they were political opponents. So it's just kind of interesting to see how they came up with this plan, but they didn't quite think it all the way through. So, because like I said, the vice president and president were supposed to serve together. Let's see here. The body of electors became known as the Electoral College. The Electoral College has changed from what it was when the founders created it. So it looks much different today than it did then. In 1796, again, you see where Adams and Jefferson become president, vice president. So the nation had a president, vice president of different political parties, and obviously that is not ideal. It's hard to get things done when you've got 2 separate political parties that are serving as president and vice president. In 1804, the 12th Amendment, and I know we've talked about this a little bit in class, made some changes to this electoral process. But the most important and the most significant change was that the electors would now cast 1 ballot for president and then a second ballot for vice president. To kind of go this a step further, each state receives a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives as combined. So let me think of an example for this. So if you look at California, California has 35 House representatives and 2 senators. Therefore, California receives 55 electoral votes based on those numbers. Okay, so that's why it's broken down. So that's why when you see like elections today for the president, it's not just a straight popular vote. It's based on those numbers right there. And I think 48 out of the 50 states basically do an all or nothing type of election, meaning that if you were in one of those 48 states, I guess I should count DC in there as well, so 51. But if you were in one of those 48 states, you could cast a vote for a candidate who does not ultimately get a majority of the votes in that state, and basically it doesn't matter. Now, there's a lot of proponents to that. There's a lot that say, okay, well, it should just be a straight popularity vote, and again, that leads to it basically goes against what our founding fathers were trying to put together when they put the Constitution together. Again, they weren't sure that it was a good idea for a straight popular vote. Which again, I would recommend that there's some good resources on trying to understand what the thought process was behind that. I just don't have enough time to go over that in this video. If we were in class, we would probably spend a whole day, if not a couple of days, on just that topic. So it breaks my heart a little bit that we don't have time for that. Right now, there are 538 electors in the Electoral College, which means that if it's a traditional election and you've got 2 candidates, you have to receive a majority of that Electoral College, which means that the magic number is 270. So for instance, when you guys watch the upcoming presidential election, you'll hear a lot about that magic number. So you'll see presidents who will go and they will spend a majority of their time in what we call swing states, and those swing states are the ones that could go either way. And so for instance, you might get a President Trump or assumably Joe Biden. They'll spend a lot of time in states like Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, because those states basically are undecided. You won't see them spending a lot of time in a state like California or New York or Texas. Texas may be a little bit closer. You won't see them spending as much time in those states because they are a majority controlled right now, and it doesn't look like there's any chance that they will swing extremely far into the opposite direction. So, all right, so the candidate wins. We've seen this a couple of times in history where the candidate who wins the popular vote but doesn't win the more important, the Electoral College vote. We've seen that happen, as far as I can remember, 4 times in history. We see Rutherford B. Hayes was elected that way. You have George W. Bush. You have Donald Trump. I'm trying to think of who the other one was. Maybe it'll come to me later on. But there have been 4 different presidents that have been elected this way, where they did not receive a majority popular vote. They received the Electoral College vote. It's interesting because for a long time there were 2 in American history. And in my lifetime, and I've been on the earth for a grand total of 36 years, I've actually seen this happen twice. In fact, I remember an elementary school or a middle school teacher of mine talking about how it's very unlikely that this will ever happen again, and here it's happened twice since then. I'm holding that against you. All right. When this happens, we call this president a minority president. So if you ever hear that terminology, they're not talking about race or ethnicity here. They're talking about a minority president, someone who was elected, but they did not have a majority of the popular vote. And Donald Trump, of course, is the latest version of that. That's why they're saying in the upcoming election that there's another possibility of a president that could receive a majority of the popular vote and still not take the presidency. But it is rare. It hasn't happened that many times throughout history. I'm trying to see. I think the other one was Benjamin Harrison. So you may want to look that up. I think that was one of your quiz questions. So Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, George W. Bush, and Donald J. Trump. Let's see here. The president, of course, serves for 4 years. There are George Washington, when he was elected president. There were many, including some of those in his cabinet, that wanted him to retain that position, that he had basically been elected twice to be president, so 8 years, and he had the opportunity, but he said he wanted to establish that this was not a lifetime position, so after 4 years, he walked away. And so that became the standard. Now, that is not written into the Constitution, or it wasn't written into the Constitution. Basically, a president could run as many times as he wanted, but Washington had established that, you know what, presidencies, they shouldn't be lifetime appointments, that 8 years is enough. And so he set that as the precedent. That was not challenged for a really long time. That did not change until Teddy Roosevelt came along later. And then finally, successfully accomplished for the first time through Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was elected 4 times. His 4th term started in 1944. And it's an interesting little note in history that after he died, as soon as he died, the nation apparently was ready for a change in this. So they adopted the 22nd Amendment. And in the 22nd Amendment, it basically says that a president may be elected to only 2 terms, and he can't serve as president for more than 10 years. Now, if you guys are doing the math right now, you're saying, but Mr. Mincer, how can they serve 10 years if they've only been elected to 2 terms? That's 8 years. Well, you can also be, and we've seen this many times in history, where someone has taken over the presidency and they were serving as vice president. Lyndon B. Johnson being an example of this, where he could have actually run for a 3rd term because, of course, he became president part of the way through John F. Kennedy's term, because John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So anyway, there's some qualifications, just like with a senator or with a congressman. There's 3 qualifications, and again, it deals with the exact same 3 areas. You've got age. You've got, so for instance, a president has to be 35 years old in order to be elected. So I'm 36. I get to run now. I'm excited about that. I'm sure you guys are all excited for me. Number 2, they have to be a natural-born citizen. And number 3, they must have resided in the United States for at least 14 years. Okay. There's a lot of informal qualifications as well. Those are not written into the Constitution. And what I mean by informal qualifications, this is where we've never elected anyone under 40 years of age, even though, again, the minimum's 35. We've never elected anyone who's actually 35, 36. The minimum's been 40 up until this point, and it makes sense. Most people would like to have someone who's older, perceivably wiser. Now, they're all politicians. They're not that wise to begin with, but that's the idea behind it. And most of the time, traditionally, candidates have had at least some political experience. And we've seen exceptions to this, especially in the last election where we saw Donald Trump was elected and he had very little political background. His only really political background was that he had run for president before as a third-party candidate. Also, traditionally, most presidents have been Protestant, meaning they've been believers in Christianity. Some the only one that comes to my mind as an example of not necessarily a traditional Protestant would be John F. Kennedy. And of course, he was Catholic, so he still had that Christian, Roman Catholic Christian background as well. Okay. It kills me not being able to go over more stuff with you about the presidency. I'm skipping some pages here where it goes over all the different presidents of the United States. Lots of interesting facts and information there. Hopefully you guys can do that research on your own. I'm not going to require anything extra for you to do. All right. Let's see here. Presidential succession. If the president is removed from office, dies or resigns, the vice president takes his place. The 25th Amendment, which was adopted in 1967, states that under such circumstances, the vice president shall become president. Now, before this 25th Amendment existed, it was kind of just assumed that that's exactly what would happen. The Constitution did not technically say that the vice president would become president, but the powers and duties would basically devolve to him. However, again, people started to realize, okay, this needs to be written into the Constitution, so that's what happened in 1967, is they actually wrote that into the Constitution, so that way it wouldn't be challenged. Let's skip a lot of the rest of this, and let's just talk about the vice president for a minute. So, other than basically being prepared to serve in case the president can't meet his obligations, the vice president basically has two primary responsibilities. First of all, as we've talked about before, he presides over the Senate. We went over that when we talked about the powers of Congress. The second, should the need arise, is to help determine when the president is unable to carry out his responsibilities, and then he himself would serve as the acting president. The 12th Amendment stipulates that the vice president must meet the same formal qualifications as a president. So if you are running as vice president of the United States, then you have to meet those same types of qualifications that the president does. Let's see here. Gerald Ford became president. So I'll give you an example of this. Became president. He was the first president in American history who was not elected to office. Now think about that for a second. So you've got Gerald Ford. He became president, but he was not elected either to vice presidency or to the presidency. That's because the original vice president to Richard Nixon was Agnew. Spiro Agnew, and Agnew resigned, and the Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan was the first person to be nominated by the president and approved by Congress. So when when he left office, Gerald Ford actually took over for him. 25th Amendment affected Ford. So what I was going to say about all this is that Gerald Ford was affected by the 25th Amendment in three ways. The first way was he was nominated to be vice president, and that happened because of the 25th Amendment. Second, when he became president on the resignation of Richard Nixon, so again, 25th Amendment connection. And third, when he chose a vice president to replace him, when he became president, he actually, of course, he nominated his own vice president who would take place for him. Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to confuse you on that. I just wanted to make sure you understood. Because one of those kind of unique things in history that I wanted you to be aware of. All right. Let's talk about the powers of the president. So this is this is probably the most important section that we are going to go over in this chapter, and that is basically, okay, well, what powers does he have? Now, there's 5 basically roles or responsibilities of the president. And again, I recommend you write these down. Number 1, he is the chief of state. Okay, and I'll explain what all these mean in just a second. The first one is that he's chief of state. Number 2, that he is the chief executive. Chief of state, chief executive. Number 3, that he is the chief legislator. Number 4, that he is the chief diplomat. And number 5, that he is the commander-in-chief. Now again, I know I went through those quickly, but I'm going to go through each of these and break them down. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'm going to give you all 5 of these very quickly. So number 1, chief of state. This is that the president is the ceremonial head of the government and the symbol of national unity. Okay, this is why you'll talk about, like, presidents have to have a presidential nature to them, that they have to act presidentially because they have to serve in a lot of those areas. So for instance, they give the inaugural address. Okay, that's the address that they give every single year to update us about the status of the nation. That's not necessarily a requirement, but it's one of those things that we just expect our leader to do. Okay, number 2. I talked about him being the chief executive. Now, obviously, it makes sense because this is the executive branch of our government. The president is responsible to see that the laws of the federal government are enforced, or as the Constitution puts it, faithfully executed. Okay, again, we talked about this before about what the power of the executive branch is that they have to uphold and enforce the laws. Okay. Number 3, they of course are the chief legislator. Now, again, you guys are probably like scratching your heads. Well, how can they be the legislator if they're the executive? This is not the legislative branch. This is the executive branch. Now, but he is. While he's not, the president is not like a designated part of the legislative branch. The president is sometimes referred as the chief legislator, in the sense that they have the ability to influence the lawmaking process. I went back to this a few minutes ago, or in the previous chapter when I talked about they had both an influence on what can be recommended as legislative bills, but let's not also forget that they also have the power of the veto, which gives him the most powerful vote when it comes to the legislature. So that's why the president is the chief legislator, and that's number 3. All right, number 4, the president is the chief diplomat. The chief diplomat. That just means the president has the power to extend national recognition to foreign countries, propose and ratify treaties, and issue executive agreements. Again, I'd love to break this down for you a little bit more and talk about, for instance, President Nixon going to China and creating the relationship there. But unfortunately, we just don't have time for it today. So I recommend if you want to take a look at that would be an interesting area to look at the power of the presidency. But again, that's just the chief diplomat. And then finally, in kind of connection to the chief diplomat, as far as like their influence in other countries, the president is also, of course, the commander-in-chief. And that means that he is in charge of all of our armed forces. The president holds extensive military power. He not only controls the military forces of the federal government, but also may call out the organized state militia, meaning the National Guard, when necessary. The president may use his military power to maintain domestic peace as well as protect the nation against foreign invaders, although the president usually delegates much of this military authority to the Defense Department. All right, I think that covers everything that I wanted to go over with you. We'll go over a little bit about the president's team in the next chapter as far as his cabinet and their power. But for today, this should cover you guys for the quiz material. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. You can call, but be keeping in mind if you call, you need to have a parent on the phone with you when you talk to me. And then I think that covers us. So we'll see you guys for the next chapter in a couple of minutes or whenever you decide to watch that. Thanks.